What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Muscle Memoirs Podcast. As always, I am joined by Michael Murray across from me, and today we're super excited to sit down and talk to Chris Barakat. Chris, you're a published researcher, educator, coach, natural bodybuilder, and also a co-author of a fairly recently released book with Jeff Nippard, The Ultimate Guide to Body Recomposition. So we're super excited to have you here today, Chris. How are you, man?
Doing well, guys. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
Oh, of course. Chris, aside from kind of what I got at there in pertaining to your background, could you give us maybe a little bit more about who you are for our listeners that may not be familiar with you and your work?
Yeah, for sure. So I started getting involved with natural bodybuilding in 2011. I was just 19 years old at the time. And I basically caught the bug. And rather than going to school for physical therapy like I originally intended, I started studying exercise sciences and nutritional sciences. So I went to grad school for that, started doing research as a master's student there. And we had a bunch of research projects that still weren't done, and I still wanted to be involved. So I started teaching at the university part-time. So I'm an adjunct professor there, and I still work in the human performance lab. Besides that, I coach full-time. That's basically, I feel like I do a lot of things full-time, but I coach full-time, I research a lot. And I definitely teach part-time at the university. That's a really small part of what I do. But yeah, I absolutely just fell in love with the field and been really fortunate to study things that I'm truly interested in. It's not like I went to an exercise science program and they were doing some sort of research on cardiovascular topics that didn't interest me. Like everything was directly related to bodybuilding. And from there, I've been able to investigate my own questions and kind of dive down that entire rabbit hole.
Awesome. Well, you definitely have the experience, the expertise, and the passion that we're super excited to kind of get into today and just hear what you have to say about the training topics we're going to kind of dive into here. So kind of getting things going here in terms of training. Our first topic we're going to kind of get into is exercise sequencing. So, Chris, within the session, we're kind of looking at what's more optimal, I guess, in terms of picking exercises to train in the shortened position versus the lengthened position. And I was recently listening to your episode with Steve Hall on the Revive Stronger podcast. You kind of got into this a little bit, talking about, for example, something starting with such as an RDL may not be the most advantageous because you're training that lengthening position. It's going to produce a lot of muscle damage. And if you're chasing the logbook, that may be beneficial in terms of getting better at the RDL. But overall, your entire body of work within that training session may not be as great compared to starting with an exercise that trains in the shortened position. So we kind of want to get your thoughts on that and which one, kind of elaborating more, should be performed first.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's really important to ask what is the trainee's primary goal. If it's totally about hypertrophy, I do think that exercise sequencing is very important. Whereas if they have a strength-specific goal, they're just going to have to prioritize whatever lift they really want to create the most amount of tension in and get the strongest at. So you want to just start with hypertrophy, I guess, and kind of dive down the topics you mentioned?
Yeah, sure. That sounds great.
Cool? All right, cool. So yeah, going to that example, like we understand that exercises that overload a muscle in its lengthened position or that are very eccentric dominant exercises, we understand that that does create more muscle damage. There isn't a lot of research on how that's going to affect your acute performance within the session and how that's going to affect subsequent exercises thereafter. But it's my hypothesis, and from what I've seen from my own training log books, from my clients' training log books, if I perform something like an RDL that is very eccentrically dominant and does create a lot of muscle damage, you kind of just feel the soreness the next day. If I were to perform a hamstring curl later in that session, my ability to perform X amount of pounds on that hamstring curl is going to be hindered. Like it's going to decrease compared to if I did those hamstring curls fresh, which makes sense. But interestingly, on the flip side, if I did hamstring curls first with maximal load because I was fresh and I did an exercise that overloaded that muscle group in its shortened position, even if I did 3 working sets and then I did RDLs afterwards, I'm not as fatigued and I can still move more total weight throughout the entire session, and my my RDL performance wasn't hindered the same way it would have been if those exercise sequence were different. Couple other examples I can use just to give the listeners some more things to visualize. If I start off the exercise performing a pec deck, right? If I did a machine chest fly that had equal amount of tension throughout the entire range, I might be able to use that as a good primer or as a good like activation exercise, just so when I get into my presses, I already have blood in that tissue. I have a better mind-muscle connection, especially if my primary goal is hypertrophy. Now, I would get that stimulus from a pec deck machine. But if I were to do something like dumbbell flies, where there's almost no concentric tension at the top and a crazy amount of tension in that lengthened position, that creates a lot more damage. And I would see that my bench press numbers are probably going to take a hit if I did a dumbbell fly compared to a pec deck fly, just because of the nature of the movement and how it's taxing the muscle in a different fashion.
Gotcha. So when it comes to, I guess, programming and selecting whether or not you want to do a single joint movement first versus a multi-joint movement first and then going to a single joint movement, what kind of other factors and variables are you considering when you're making that choice to program it a certain way?
Yeah, I've experimented with a lot of things over the years. So things that I might have done 2 years ago are totally different than what I'm currently doing. And I don't know what is optimal, but I'm still on the search for it. A lot of times I do start with a single joint primer. For a leg day, this can be a lying leg curl. This can be even a leg extension before getting into a compound lift. For me, as a bodybuilder, where the main goal is hypertrophy, I like performing exercises that can overload that muscle tissue in its fully shortened position, where muscle activation is going to be highest. You have the greatest overlap of the actin and myosin. I think that there are some chemical signaling pathways that happen in those shortened positions that might not happen in the mid-range or in the lengthened range. So I personally enjoy that as a bodybuilder, but if I was right now, the way I'm programming my training, I do have like a more strength focused day where I start with my compound first, just because I'm really focused on maximizing the amount of load I could use. And I don't want any sort of fatigue accumulation before going into that main compound lift. So kind of depends on your goal. If there's any sort of specific questions, we can dive into that. If you want to provide like a situation or a scenario, that would really help, because I always feel like context is super important.
Well, I kind of want to dive into a little bit. Maybe it'll give the listeners a little bit more a context of what we're talking about here. So when we're talking about your specific training, you kind of alluded to, you have a strength day, so maybe you're going to perform a compound first, where you're kind of prioritizing increasing the load over time. And then could you kind of maybe give an example of another day, or a hypertrophy focused day, if you will, of like your favorite exercise sequencing for a session?
Sure. So a typical hypertrophy session for me looks like some sort of single joint primer in the beginning of the session. Like I said, that can be a lying hamstring curl, that can be a leg extension, maybe a combination of the two. For an upper body day, it might be something like the Pec Deck Fly. And then I would go into those compound lifts. So it can be incline barbell for a push day. It can be dumbbell incline for a push day. For a leg day, it's going to be some sort of squat pattern. It could be a barbell back squat, a hack squat, or even a leg press. So then I get into my compounds. Then for something like a leg day, it's probably going to be another compound lift where I do some sort of hip hinging movement. So I don't want to do just one compound that's really targeting the quads and the glutes. I want to do another compound that's going to really target the hamstrings to some sort of degree. So it might be some sort of deadlift variation or a hip hinge. And then I would probably finish with more isolation work, or just some of the smaller muscle groups that didn't get touched at all. So it can be something like a calf raise. If I didn't do leg extensions at the beginning, I would do it at the end, vice versa. So it's typically, primers or isolations to start, heavier compounds in the middle, and then maybe some more isolation or pump work towards the end. Generally speaking, I start with exercise that overload the shortened position, then more so compound lifts that are typically hardest in that mid-range, and then some sort of exercise that overload the muscle in their lengthened position.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So, Chris, you kind of mentioned the utility of priming exercises. Could you give the listeners a little background about what the difference is between a primer as opposed to a pre-exhaust method?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the biggest difference with a primer and a pre-exhaust is going to be the intensity of effort you're training with in that exercise. So I can literally perform that Pec Deck Fly as a chest primer on a push day to get some blood into my pecs, improve my muscle connection with my chest before getting into my pressing movements. And I would keep my, my rate of perceived exertion closer to like a 6 out of 10. So I'm staying pretty far away from failure. I'm getting really solid concentric contractions, but it's not like I'm, close to 2 reps in the tank or 3 reps in the tank. I'm saving a lot more in the tank. So I'm not really creating a lot of fatigue locally or systemically. And then I would get into a compound. Whereas if I were to do something as a pre-exhaust, that has a lot of merit too. So let's take squats, for example. If I wanted to pre-exhaust my quads before going into squats, maybe I would do leg extensions at a very high intensity of effort and actually take those to failure or even past failure. So I'm intentionally working with less loads when I'm squatting, maybe because there's going to be a reduced risk of injury if you're just working with lighter loads while you're squatting. Whatever it may be, or maybe you have a little bit of low back issues or you have some knee issues, so you don't want to maximally load that exercise, but you still want to train that movement pattern close to failure with lighter loads. And if you pre-exhaust, that still gives you the ability to do that, right? So if I took my leg extensions to failure and then went into squats, my body doesn't really know if I have 315 on the bar or 275 on the bar. As long as my effort and the intensity is there, I'm still going to get a great stimulus out of it. So there can be some merit to that.
So this is it's a pretty nuanced topic, something Cole and I have been trying to wrap our brains around, and something we kind of dove into with Ryan, gonna butcher his last name, Leacular, on a topic. He and Dr. Ben House do a podcast called Bro Research Radio, and they were talking about this as well, and kind of this idea of the utility of pre-exhaust methods. So something Ryan was trying to portray when we were talking about whether pre-exhaust is beneficial or not is, so like you said, pre-exhaust allows us to use a lighter load on a compound following that. But the potential issue is that even though our relative effort is high, we generated so much central fatigue with the pre-exhaust that we, regardless of working to failure with a high relative effort on the subsequent movement, we're actually not able to fully recruit those high threshold motor units. And from what I understand, this could be a potential decrement to long-term adaptations if we're sacrificing mechanical tension on one of those big multi-joint movements. What are your thoughts on this? Like, does it make sense what I'm trying to get at here?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. In theory, that makes a lot of sense. There isn't a ton of data on this. I was fortunate enough to be part of an advanced training technique study. I highly recommend you guys check it out. The primary author was my buddy Will Wallace. I believe it's called like Advanced Training Techniques. We looked at pre-exhaustion, we looked at supersets, we looked at force negatives, we looked at a lot of different things. And it was an acute study, so you guys can get some really great insight there. But going back to your point, I tend to disagree with how much systemic fatigue you're going to create with the pre-exhaust method, depending on what exercise you utilized for pre-exhaust. So even if I took something like leg extensions to failure, because it's a single joint isolation movement, I'm not convinced that I'm going to create so much central fatigue that it's going to inhibit my ability to recruit those high threshold motor units in that subsequent exercise. So I think more research is needed to be sure. But it's something that you can experiment with. There's no reason to not try this for maybe 1 out of X amount of sessions or do this for a 4-week block and just kind of see how you respond. I think something that's super interesting in exercise science and in this field is there's so many different responders regardless of what protocol they're actually following. So every time we do research, we're always looking at the group means and the averages, but I always see such a large variance between the individuals in each group, and some people are responding really well to this stimulus, and some people are responding really well to another stimulus. I don't want to go too far off topic, but something that I kind of just recently, I don't want to say realized, that I almost feel like it's something that I want to admit is, I feel like for me, my legs respond better for hypertrophy when I'm training in much higher rep ranges. I spent a lot of time training in the 6 to 12, 6 to 15 rep range for my legs, and I don't feel like I've made much progress in that rep range. And for some reason, I feel like I get more growth when I'm training my legs in that 15 to 30 rep range. So it's something I'm experimenting with now. Something I actually did earlier on in my training career, but that can kind of skew my perception on, was it working well because I was training in this rep range, or was it working well because I was still a beginner intermediate trainee and I was going to respond regardless, or my rate of growth and my rate of progress was going to be better regardless because I was so much younger at that time, or the training stimulus as a whole was more novel. But it's something I'm getting back to now, and I'm really enjoying it.
So that's definitely something we want to dive into further later on in this discussion, because it is a fascinating concept. And I saw kind of your post on Instagram about that, and it was very, very interesting. In regards to the priming versus pre-exhaust, at least personally, I'm totally on board with this concept of priming. Like you said, kind of keeping a few reps in the tank. I think it's particularly useful if you struggle to connect with a certain muscle, doing something like that beforehand, just to get a feel for what you should be feeling without generating too much fatigue. But when it comes to figuring out whether or not pre-exhaust works for you, and you experiment with that within a block, how do you recommend assessing whether or not there's a benefit to that? Is it maybe based on how much your performance drops off following the pre-exhaust? If there's only a minimal drop off, it's probably safe to say that pre-exhaust is, not as detrimental or anything like that.
Yeah, I think it would be ideal if you were able to have a logbook and track your data in a very acute fashion. So just for the listeners, we'll keep the same example over and over again so they can just kind of stay on the same page. Let's just take the leg extension as a primer. Let's take the leg extension as a pre-exhaust, and then let's take your main compound lift. We can just call it the back squat or a hack squat as your main compound. I would experiment with a few different ways. So I would do the leg extension as a primer, which means I'm not getting close to failure. I'm going to see how that may improve my squat, whether it's I get a better pump while I'm performing squats, I have a better mind-muscle connection while I'm performing squats. Do my loads increase, decrease, or stay the same when I'm doing squats compared to when I didn't do the primer whatsoever? Then you can say, okay, now I'm going to do this as a pre-exhausting method. I'm going to go to failure on these leg extensions. You're going to log your numbers. How much load are you using for how much weight? Okay, cool. Then you're going to go into your squat. All right, did that kill my squat? And I had to lift like 30% less weight because I just shot my quads to death on the leg extension? Or was I able to maintain a decent amount of load and it just felt better as a whole, or did it feel worse as a whole? And then the third option is to say, all right, I'm not going to do a single joint movement first. I'm going to start with my compound like I may typically do in the past. And then I'm going to perform the leg extension afterwards, and I'm going to see if I can still use the same loads that I was able to on the pre-exhaustion, or did the squat pre-fatigue my quads so much that I can't perform leg extensions now to the same intensity with the same loads as if they came first. So if you can experiment with all three of those methods, I think you'll be able to pick which route you want to use moving forward, whether you want to do it as a primer where it's just kind of a warm-up, or if you want to do it as a pre-exhaust, or if you don't want to do it whatsoever.
All right. Very, very interesting. A lot to think about there and to consider for sure. So transitioning just a little bit,
Sure.
Talking about structuring a microcycle and even maybe a mesocycle here. For you personally, you kind of talked about this again on, I think, that episode with Steve Hall, and then I'm sure a couple other places as well. When you're structuring a mesocycle, or a microcycle rather, do you prioritize certain functions of a muscle within that microcycle, such as only training pronated grip like pull-ups and lat pull-downs within one microcycle, or are you doing, say, a pronated pull-down and then a neutral grip pull-down within the same microcycle? Or within a single mesocycle, are you like prioritizing a certain grip or movement, and then the next mesocycle you do a subsequent grip or movement, if you know what I'm kind of getting at here?
Yeah, for sure. So there's a lot of ways to go about it. If I can, for the listeners, I just want to provide context so they have a better idea of why this is important. So when we look at more complex muscles like the chest and the lats, they have so many functions. Okay, so we'll take the chest, for example, because I spoke about the pec deck before. We understand that the primary function of the pec is going to be horizontal adduction, so bringing your upper arm closer to your sternum, right, pulling your upper arm straight across your body. When you perform something like a flat bench, you're typically training your shoulder joint, your glenohumeral joint through that horizontal adduction plane. It also performs things like shoulder flexion, especially when you're trying to target that clavicular head. And it also performs pure adduction, where it's bringing your upper arm straight down to your side. This would look like a high to low fly. This would almost mimic to like dips and also decline presses. They kind of train that shoulder joint in this adduction plane of movement. And the costal portion of your pec major is actually a really large head. And those costal fibers are the ones that pull your upper arm straight down to your side and perform that adduction movement. So if you're never performing decline presses, dips, or high to low flies, or you're just not performing any exercise that trains the shoulder joint through adduction, you're missing a huge part of your pec major. You're not targeting those muscle fibers to the extent that you can and you should. So it's important that you include exercises, whether it's within a microcycle or a mesocycle, that does train every single function of that muscle, especially if you're trying to maximize hypertrophy. So going back to your question, I typically train nearly every function within each microcycle, but it might be on different days. So right now I'm training, I have a push day, and then I have like a chest and arm day. And on my push day, I'm doing barbell incline, and I'm doing heavy dips. I'm doing weighted dips. So I'm basically training that flexion pattern. I'm getting my clavicular head really, really well. And then with the dips, I'm getting those costal fibers really well as I'm performing more of an adduction movement. But I'm not doing a typical horizontal push. I'm not doing a flat bench. I'm not doing anything like that on my first day within that microcycle. But later on in the week, when I train chest and arms, I do a Pec Deck Fly, which is training horizontal adduction, and I do a flat press. So I make sure that I get it in within the week. It just doesn't have to be within the same session. Now, realistically, you can go a whole mesocycle and maybe skip, one muscle function as long as you address it later on. I don't see the purpose of that unless you're doing extremely low volume. Maybe you're more of a beginner and you're just sticking to some very basic exercise. You're sticking to some core movement patterns. I think for beginners, they can have much simpler exercise selection and a fewer total amount of exercises to do. So maybe they'll address it later on in a different mesocycle. But I think for late intermediate to advanced, this should be addressed throughout the microcycle, not just through mesocycles.
Gotcha. Cool.
Yeah.
And what are your thoughts on taking this example again of doing an incline barbell press, and then within that same session you say move to an incline dumbbell press. So you're training the same movement and function of that muscle within the same session. Is that a detriment because you're kind of just stimulating that same area, those same fibers, to a point where you're not maximally getting the most out of your session?
Yeah, I personally think that's basically a waste of time. I would just do more working sets on one particular exercise than do two exercises that are extremely similar. Another example of that, I actually see this in a lot of people's programming. They might do like barbell curls, like standing barbell curls, and then they might do like a cable curl or a standing dumbbell curl. And they're just training elbow flexion with their shoulder still at 0 degrees, like they're still in the same position, rather than doing like one exercise or one bicep curl with, their shoulder maybe in a flexed position, or doing something like a preacher curl. And then their next exercise, they're doing like an incline dumbbell curl where their shoulder is extended behind them and they're stretching the long head of the bicep. So yeah, to me, there's no reason to do two exercises that train the same exact movement pattern, but provide some sort of variation within the same session. Now, I do think you can do incline barbell on one day and then dumbbell incline on the next, but I just don't see the point of doing that within the same session.
Gotcha. Makes sense.
Yeah,
Makes sense.
that's a great session. That's a great question, though, and a lot of people do, I believe, misprogram, and they're just inefficient with their time and their effort by making a simple mistake like that.
For sure.
Yeah.
So now I'm going to kind of go into the role of frequency and neuromuscular adaptation in tracking your training performance. So when it comes to making improvements in performance on single joint exercises, it's kind of a valid way to kind of assess your progress is across multiple sets, and it's just easier, I guess, overall to see those improvements because of it being a single joint compared to something like a multi-joint lift where, for example, and something that I've done myself is I've trained incline barbell bench 3 times across a week, and I've seen improvements in my incline bench, but is it neural adaptations that are driving those improvements, or am I actually increasing my cross-sectional area, in my chest? So I guess what I'm getting at here is, should we limit training frequency for multi-joint movements in order to be sure that the gains are being made in regards to cross-sectional area versus neuromuscular adaptations?
Sure. That's a great question, man. And I don't think anyone has the definitive answer here yet. It's definitely a combination of the two. So the more frequently you perform a movement pattern, you're going to become more efficient and more skilled at that movement pattern. So your strength should go up from neural adaptations alone, regardless of CSA actually increasing or not. However, by performing a movement pattern more frequently, you're also going to increase muscle protein synthesis more frequently throughout the week, and therefore you can be more in a net anabolic state rather than being at maintenance or being in a catabolic state. And you can increase cross-sectional area. I think there is going to be the combination of the two occurring. But I'm not a huge fan of training anything more than 3 times per week, a movement pattern. I typically, right now, my frequency is closer to 2 times per week. But it depends on the person. You want to make sure that you are recovering well from session to session. The intensity that you're training at is going to be huge. So if I were to do, we'll stick with bench pressing, for example. If I were to do 5 sets of 5 reps on Monday at only 65% of my 1RM or 60% of my 1RM, so I'm doing a lot of power work, a lot of velocity work, I'm probably not going to be sore the next day. At least I shouldn't be, especially if you're highly trained and you're used to that stimulus. But you're still improving your neural adaptations. You're still improving the skill at performing that lift. You should absolutely be ready to train by Wednesday to hit that bench again. And then depending on the intensity and the volume that you perform on Wednesday, that's going to dictate whether or not you're ready to roll on Friday or not. If I absolutely smash my chest on Wednesday and I'm still sore and I feel under-recovered, I probably don't want to train it on Friday, even though the program says, hey, you got to do this 3 times per week. So it's important that the way the program is designed makes sense and you're able to recover adequately from session to session. As long as you do that and you manage your volume well, I think it's fine. But there's just so many ways to approach it. What were the other questions regarding that? Sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought.
Yeah, I guess I was just saying overall, if we should limit frequency for multi-joint movements to kind of better assess progress in terms of if we're growing more muscle, or am I simply getting more proficient at performing the lift in general?
Yeah. No, I think performing exercise 2 to 3 times per week is great. I personally haven't experimented with doing something 4 or 5 times per week. Again, depending on the intensity that you're training at and how you're kind of cycling that throughout the week, that's going to really dictate what your recovery capabilities are like. But yeah, just a combination, man, of, the skill, improving that skill, and then actually increasing protein synthesis. Something we do know in regards to the research is the more advanced you become, the shorter that muscle protein synthesis is elevated due to the actual training session. Some data shows it might only be elevated for as short as 16 hours post-workout for advanced lifters, whereas a lot of previous research thought that, okay, you have about 72 hours of being in an elevated, more anabolic state because of the training session you did. And it seems like that window decreases the more advanced you become, so frequency may be a better option for more advanced trainees. On the flip side of that token, I'm not sure if you guys really follow like a lot of the enhanced bodybuilding side of the sport or not, but a lot of those people still prefer their bro splits because they feel like at their level of advancement and the amount of volume they do within one session, they're literally not really able to train until 4, 5, or 6 days later after that training session. So I think it depends. I think it depends on so many factors. How strong is the actual trainee? What loads are they working with? And then what their recovery timetable is actually looking like.
Gotcha. Cool.
And I mean, considering we don't have like hard science on this and most of it is speculation, I mean, perhaps we can just look at general differences between powerlifters and bodybuilders. So, I mean, if we look at, perhaps a 180-pound bodybuilder compared to a 180-pound powerlifter, that powerlifter might be squatting 3 times per week and their barbell back squat might be, 50 pounds higher than the bodybuilder, but the bodybuilder may very well have bigger quads and just a general lower body. So perhaps that's something to consider as well, and the role of frequency for like one particular lift.
Yeah, for sure. And again, that's a great point you make about bodybuilders and powerlifters. It's like, what is the goal of the lift too? If the powerlifters are training at extremely high intensities closer to their 1RM, their recoverability is going to be different compared to a bodybuilder lifting at more moderate intensities or lighter loads, but at higher rep ranges. Most of the time too, the bodybuilder, can perform, their strength endurance is better. So their 10 RM or their 15 RM is going to be much better. Whereas the powerlifter is going to have a much higher 1 RM, but not as good of a 10 RM. And then going back to the cross-sectional area, the bodybuilder is probably going to have much bigger quads, but that powerlifter is going to probably have more of those neural adaptations and a greater absolute strength level. So they're very, very different sports in my opinion. And the way that you program needs to take your goals into consideration. What do you actually want to prioritize?
For sure. I completely agree. So Chris, I want to transition back to your leg training experiment where you're utilizing a higher rep range than you recently have, and just kind of provide us with a little bit more background about, why you're doing that, the rationale, and then also, I guess, how you found out that you're probably better at performing high reps rather than low reps.
Sure. All right, so a few things. When I first got involved with bodybuilding, I wasn't necessarily looking at the literature. I was looking at people in the field. I was looking at contestants and seeing, all right, what are their splits like? What's their training like? And that's kind of where it started. So when I first started training, I was basically taking training splits and programs from just other competitors in the field. It wasn't really research based. And I remember one of my training partners back then, his name is Mike Charles. He's a really good national NPC competitor. Some of the training sessions we would do like 100 reps for the first set of leg extensions, then 50, then 25. And then we would do stuff like that on leg press, where we do like 100 reps of leg press, then 50 reps of leg press, then 25 reps of leg press. Like that was the pyramid. And it was insane, right? It was like absolutely insane. But again, I made great progress back then, but I was also a beginner. On the contrary, he was just a much higher level bodybuilder. But those are some things that you would see in some of the elite natural pros and some of the elite enhanced people. They would just do crazy sets. Like there's this natural bodybuilder, his name's Francisco Montaglair, and he would leg press on a timer. Like he would just leg press for like 3 minutes straight. It wasn't like I'm doing X amount of reps. It's like I'm just going to leg press this thing over and over. And like he would kind of do rest pause in between, but he wouldn't rack the weight until that 3 minute timer was up. And they're doing a lot of these crazy things that I experimented with in the past. I got good results on. And the reason why I'm switching back to that now is because my strength, my ability to like crank out reps at a very low velocity is really good. So let's just say I'm doing like a set of 12 to 15, or even like, let's say 10 to 12 on upper body lift. Whoever's spotting me might think like I'm done at like rep 6 or 7 because the bar is moving so freaking slow. But I'm able to crank out more reps at very slow velocities. And I think that gives me some feedback in regards to my fiber type. I feel like I'm very slow twitch dominant, and I don't really have a lot of fast twitch muscle fibers. Also part of the reason why I'm probably not like a mass monster by any means, and I struggle to really put on a lot of size and density. But I've been training in those lower rep ranges for quite some time now, and I just feel like I haven't gotten the response I want. So going to my leg training, I've been switching a lot of my compound lifts to higher rep goals, and my strength endurance is decent, but my absolute strength is crap. So I'm really trying to take those slow twitch muscle fibers to their true failure point, right? An argument that kind of counteracts what I'm doing is people say, well, it doesn't really matter because if you lift with heavier loads, and let's say you reached failure at 6 RM or 8 RM, you still recruited all of your motor units, which is 100% true. Like if you take something to failure, everything's going to be engaged. The issue with that is even though I recruited all of my motor units and my slow twitch muscle fibers came into play, they turned on and they helped with the movement. And I failed at that load because I just wasn't able to produce any more force. We understand that if someone is more slow twitch dominant, they're not going to be able to produce a lot of force in a low rep range. So if I'm doing stuff at a higher rep range, I'm actually taking those muscle fibers closer to their true failure point, not from a neurological standpoint, but more from more at the cellular level, not from a neuromuscular standpoint. Does that make sense? I see kind of getting it. I see it.
Yeah, so correct me if I'm wrong, but so your experiment, it's not particularly based on trying to target slow twitch fibers with high reps as opposed to targeting fast twitch fibers with low reps. It's more so that you found that you can like progress your performance better through utilizing higher reps because overall as an individual, you are generally composed of more slow twitch fibers, right? Yeah. Like it's kind of like a nuanced difference there. Like we're driving performance rather than trying to target specific fiber hypertrophy.
For sure. And like I said, just when I look at my logbooks or when I look at how I actually perform and what happens when I'm reaching failure, it leads me to believe I should be spending more time in that rep range, and it's going to, although slow twitch fibers have a much smaller degree or a smaller degree of potential to actually grow, I might as well spend more time in that rep range and try to maximize the hypertrophy of those fibers through my training parameters, if that's what I'm kind of composed of more, right? So someone who's more fast twitch dominant, like once they fail, like they're not able to like really squeeze out more reps. Their bar velocity is usually great, and then you don't really see bar velocity significantly slow down for them, and they're still cranking out reps. It's just like they're able to do it, it gets hard, and they're just done. They're unable to do it. Where with me, when I'm working at those certain rep ranges, I'm my reps, my last 5 reps are like brutally slow, but I'm still just able to somehow crank it out. And I think I'll be able to progress better in those higher rep ranges than I have in the more lower to moderate rep ranges. And I'm going to see what that leads to in regards to my physique and my performance.
Absolutely fascinating. Yeah, I haven't really heard anyone else talk about this in this respect. Again, it's usually just arguing about whether you can specifically target slow twitch as opposed to fast twitch, rather than, as far as general performance and progress goes. So you kind of mentioned that you can tell sort of if you're preferentially slow twitch or fast twitch as a whole by your ability to grind reps. Is that kind of what it comes down to, just seeing how good you are grinding out reps, or are there other strategies you might utilize to figure this out, perhaps like an AMRAP at 80%, or maybe your rep drop off from set to set? Perhaps if you experience like a large drop off, maybe you're more fast twitch. Any of those?
Yeah, so I think a good way to tell is basically just comparing like your absolute strength, so which would be technically a 1RM, but if you just looked at your lower rep goals, let's say you know what your 3RM is on a bench press, and you know what your 5RM is on a bench press, and you also know what your 15RM is on a bench press, like which one of those is kind of more impressive, right? That might give you some sort of insight in regards to just what your makeup is naturally. There are some people that are just brutally strong, like out the gate, and they make really good progress when they are like power building or powerlifting. And then on the other hand, there's some people that are just more endurance based. So I think if you look at the discrepancy in performance between like something like a 3RM or a 5RM compared to maybe a 15RM or something like 70% of your 1RM and then doing an AMRAP, you can get an idea of what your fiber type composition might be and what training might be best suited for you. Like for me, even if I train like a powerlifter, I'm not going to be a good powerlifter. I'm very convinced. Now, can I give that my max effort and spend more time doing that and get better at it? Absolutely. But I just don't think genetically I'm made to lift heavy fucking loads like that in the low rep range goals. So, yeah. Right. What are you more into, by the way? Like, is one more into powerlifting, one more into bodybuilding, or you guys, what are your personal goals?
Personally, more so in the bodybuilding right now. I just transitioned out of a 24-week prep where didn't have the opportunity to make it to stage because all my shows got canceled.
Damn.
And just for where I'm at in my career, it made more sense to just transition into the off season rather than, holding out for months on end looking for some sort of show, considering I was already 24 weeks in. But before that, I competed in powerlifting for a few years. But yeah, main focus on bodybuilding.
Very cool. Cool. What about you?
I'm on the more bodybuilding side of things as well. I haven't competed. Potentially aspirations of competing one day, and then as of right now, I've been fairly limited in what I've been able to accomplish in the basement setup, considering the whole COVID situation. And at first, I was having a lot of fun with it, getting to experiment, kind of going with a more or less unstructured approach to training for the first time I had it in a while, which was kind of fun. But now I'm at kind of this training purgatory, if you will, where I feel like I'm kind of just stuck. And I don't know, I'm kind of looking forward to hopefully soon getting back to the gym, and then I can have an actual attack plan. I was talking to Mike about it, getting into a massing phase, because I haven't really done a specifically structured, goal-oriented massing phase for a couple years now. So that's just kind of where I'm at with things.
Awesome, man. Yeah, Cole, you look super familiar. Have we ever met in person?
I don't think so.
Okay. You look like my buddy Josh Vogel. I don't know if you know who that is.
Josh Vogel? No, I'll have to look him up.
Yeah, definitely look him up. He's a good hybrid athlete, bodybuilder, powerlifter.
Okay. Yeah, I thought it was interesting when you introduced yourself that you mentioned how you were going to go to physical therapy school and then you kind of went another route with it. I'm actually in physical therapy school right now, so I kind of went the other way. But
that's cool. Yeah, no, I studied athletic training for my undergrad, so I was in the sports med field, and I worked at PT clinics from the time I was 18 to 24. So I spent like 6 years in PT clinics. That's probably part of the reason that I kind of got burnt out of PT before I even started that career, because I was like I was working as an aide and the whole nine. So, yeah, man. But that's great. That's great. Where are you studying at?
I'm at Widener University in Pennsylvania, a little
Okay.
private school. Yeah.
Very cool. Awesome, man. Best of luck to you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
For
So,
sure.
last thing we want to kind of hit on here for you, Chris, and then we'll let you go. So,
Sure.
Picking the best exercises for you. So, exercise selection for
Mhm.
you. What are you looking at in terms of selecting exercises that will work for you, that are effective for you? Because a lot of times people will just like pick, maybe for example, the squat, just because it's one of the big three. It's a compound. You got to squat.
Sure.
But if it hurts your lower back or you're not feeling it in the quads, what are you looking at here in terms of like the bread and butter movements? Because I feel like sometimes people will program a movement in just for the sake of the movement and not really asking themselves, what is the goal here? What am I targeting?
Yeah, for sure. That's a great question. I think as a trainee, the more that you can educate yourself in regards to just basic anatomy and kinesiology, it's going to really help you have a better idea of what you should be doing when performing a movement and why you're actually performing the movement. If someone goes and says, okay, they want to squat because they want big legs, but they don't truly understand that, okay, as you're descending, I'm moving through hip flexion and I'm moving through knee flexion, and this is what's happening at the quad, and this is what's happening at the rec fem, and yada, yada. You're not going to be able to really visualize what's happening. And therefore, you're not going to be able to, I don't want to say execute the movement to a high degree, because there's plenty of lifters that don't know anatomy and physiology at all, but they have beautiful movement patterns. But for me, it really helps internalize and visualize what's actually happening. When it comes to selecting exercises, I think sensation is really important. If something feels good, if you literally have a stronger mind-muscle connection, if you get a better pump in that target tissue, those are all really good feedback signs that, hey, you should probably stick to that movement a bit more. But the reason why it's important to understand the anatomy and the kinesiology to your muscles and the lifts is because you can make a really minor tweak, and that might totally change how good or how bad an exercise feels. This is a super random example, but I remember when I first moved to Florida, I was training at a really ghetto gym, Powerhouse, North Tampa, and I didn't use a lot of machines for a while because their machines sucked. And then I went into a random LA Fitness, and I used a hammer strength incline machine. And this was the first time in like a year where I used a hammer strength incline machine. And I was like, holy crap, my clavicular head is just getting smashed right now. And it felt perfect. And I understood it had to do with like the position of the handle, the way that my glenohumeral joint was actually moving through that plane. Like I understood why it was happening. But if I just moved my elbow up here, or if the handle was, slightly different, it probably wouldn't have felt as well. But because I understood like the direction of pull of my clavicular head, and I just saw that the second I sat in that machine, like the seat height was perfect, and I just started pressing, and I just felt my clavicular head just turn on. I was like, all right, this is a perfect exercise for me to utilize. So then I kept that in my programming, right? Whereas if you're doing something and you're not feeling it in the muscle, or you just have some sort of joint discomfort, it doesn't mean you shouldn't do that exercise, but it does mean that you need to make an adjustment to your form, or maybe utilize some sort of external equipment, whether it can be like using a elevated heel or putting plates underneath your heels if you're squatting. So many things like that can make a massive difference. So yeah, if you understand what's going on, you're going to be better able to select exercises. Then you just need to take into consideration what's the muscle's function, what exercise is going to actually train that function of movement, or that muscle's function, and then kind of create your program. So you want to make sure that you're doing everything and you kind of checking off all your boxes, but sensation is really important when it comes to that.
Yeah, awesome. I couldn't agree with you more. And taking the example of elevating the heels and say, a barbell back squat, for me personally, that was a huge thing that helped me, because although I was like pretty decent at performing the high bar back squat, someone would ask me, be like, oh, you feel it in your quads? And I was like, I guess a little bit. Like, I don't know. And then fairly recently, I guess a few months back, I started elevating the heels, and it made a world of difference, and possibly due to mobility limitations in ankle dorsiflexion, and therefore limiting anterior translation of the tibia, and then not getting as much quad stimulus that way.
Yeah.
So it's definitely something to consider, and I think it does play a pretty important role in terms of your exercise selection and execution.
Yeah, absolutely. So earlier on in my lifting career, I did get more interested in power building because that was just the trend in the industry. So at one point I was low bar squatting, and my low bar squat was decent at one point. I think I did 315 for 10, probably at 170 pounds. But the only thing that was growing was really my glutes and like the upper portion of my quads, right? Like the proximal portion of my thigh. And I wasn't really getting much distal quad growth. My VMO wasn't really changing much because I wasn't moving through a ton of knee flexion. I wasn't getting a ton of anterior translation of the tibia. So then I switched to high bar. But I have really long femurs, really long legs, and I absolutely suck at high bar. And unfortunately, I was stubborn for years. I kept it in for years. And my best high bar ever was 315 for 5, which to me is honestly pathetic. And I was probably at that point, I was probably closer to 182 pounds compared to doing 315 for 10 at like 170-ish for low bar. But I was just really stubborn. At least I made a switch to high bar and I did something that was more quad dominant, but I'm really just not made to squat. I have super long arms. This makes me an amazing deadlifter, makes me a really shitty bench presser. But yeah, I kind of, know where to pick and choose my battles now. Because of the whole COVID situation, I am back squatting because I don't have a hack squat. So I'm doing barbell back squats right now with an elevated heel. But once the gyms reopen, I'm going back to smashing hack squats, Bulgarian split squats, and a lot of leg pressing. I won't do barbell back squats if I have a full kit. So it's not a movement for me, and I understand that certain lifts really fit my body well, like the deadlift, and certain lifts don't fit my body well at all, like the squat. So it's important to make mistakes because you'll learn from your mistakes, but make sure you don't make them for too long, because then you just kind of stay in the same spot, or you're regressing instead you could be progressing.
For sure. Yeah, you definitely went through a lot of trial and error, as I'm sure we're all going through and continue to go through, and kind of figuring your body out, what you're capable of, what feels good, and then also what your intent is for the lift and your overall training goals. So, Chris, that's going to wrap it up for what we have for you today. Definitely want to thank you a lot for coming on and chatting up with us. Super interesting conversation. I know I had a lot of fun with it. I'm sure Mike did as well. For fans, followers, and supporters that want to learn more about you, your work, or maybe interested in some coaching, where can they best find you?
Yeah, for sure. I really appreciate you guys having me on. If you ever have any questions, feel free to reach out in the future too, if I can help in any way. In regards to contacting me, the best way is to go through my website. For coaching, it's Chris at competitivebreed.com. My coaching, especially for bodybuilding, is more so through Competitive Breed. I have an educational brand that I just came out with semi-recently, the fall of 2019. That's schoolofgains.com. Gains is spelled with a Z because it's more anabolic that way.
Excellent.
You'll find a lot of educational content on there. So different articles, some research reviews, different videos. Any sort of my publications that come out, I have it linked on there, so you guys can keep up with me there. And then in terms of social media, I'm most active on Instagram. So it's just my full name, at Christopher.Barakat.
Awesome. Chris, thanks again, man. Truly appreciate it.
My pleasure. Good luck with PT school, and keep killing it.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Check out my boy, Josh Vogel. You guys look just like him.
I'm going to Google him right after this to see what's going on with that. Cool. All right, guys. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Take it easy, and we'll catch you again in the next one. Peace.